Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, and welcome back to Achampnator Reads. Today I continue with chapter 27. Fear had taken hold of the world. Everyone seemed to have gone mad. A dragon carrying an elf on its back had reappeared in Dalaga, where it had exterminated all the poultry in the county. Thousands and thousands of dead chickens were piled up under clouds of flies in a rotten stench of putrefaction. Wait a sec, I have to put my chair a bit higher so that you can see me a bit better. Sorry. Um, or at least that was the rumor going round. Robbie had never been on to Dalaga because her father and mother had always avoided going there. But Glamo, one of the bigger children, tall and thin, with black hair falling over his face, came from the city, and he said that there weren't really any chickens left in Dalaga. The judge administrator didn't want them because they made the streets untidy. A few of them walked about in the high part of the city, the least desirable area of the county, where even the soldiers were seldom seen. Even there, however, there were only a few chickens, as many as you could count on the fingers, on one hand. More or less not enough to make a mountain. A pile of them wouldn't have filled a sack. The problem was that Glamour was the biggest fibber the children had ever met. He was the son of vagrant parents who had gone from market to market selling trinkets before they had been finished off by the cold and coughs of a worse winter than usual. Like all vagrants, Glamour had the pomposity of someone who has seen everything, because he had seen lots of things, and also the conviction that the others were so stupid as to believe everything he said. It was the who maintained that there was only a single chicken alive in the lower part of Delaga, and no one dared to wring its neck, because it was a special chicken, a magic one that had already died and been brought back to life. Glamour had been beaten various times by people who were exasperated by all the nonsense he came out with, particularly Falco and Foulpest, but he insisted on talking about the chicken of Delaga that had been to the realm of the dead and had come back from it. When he wasn't making up all kinds of other fairy tales, such as saying that there were plants in Dalaga that flowed all year round, all the time he met a troll that was working as a woodcutter, along which two humans giants in the dark mountains, and they had helped his father to repair his cart. His father had given them half a ham in payment. Before eating it, they had buried it and dug it up again. Glamo had been beaten for that story as well. Even if you considered Glamo to be unreliable, the story of the mountain of dead chickens didn't make a great deal of sense. Sorry, where was I? If the dragon really had exterminated stacks of them, couldn't they have eaten the chickens rather than leaving them to rot? Or give them to the children? In the house of orphans, the chickens would have been eaten even if they were riddled with maggots. That story of piles of dead and rotting chickens stinking up the air seemed to be on a par with the abduction of Iomir. Still, according to rumors, the dragon had been confronted by the judge administrator's guard of honor, who after a tough battle had chased it away, dripping blood and practically at death's door. But clearly, dragons recover from mortal wounds more easily than children from blisters on their hands, given that the creature had managed to soar over the house of orphans, fast and powerful, almost as high as the clouds. Stories went flying about, growing ever more outlandish as they did so. The only certain thing was that there was more work to do, and less maize porridge. And when they weren't picking apples to send to Delagar, they were digging trenches in the mud. Since poor Ayomir's abduction by the beast, everyone had to work strictly in pairs, each member responsible for the other, and answerable to flesh and slump. Fortunately, Robbie and was with Kala. Of all the terrible jobs that Robbie had ever done, the trenches were the worst. The mud was soft. Robbie slipped and slipped and slipped again. There were worms in the mud and a kind of hairy caterpillar that looked as though it had gone to sleep, but when it woke up, it gave you nasty bites that hurt for hours. Slump had come up with the idea of the trenches. He knew as much about military strategy as he did about the astronomy, which is to say, absolutely nothing. But having developed the habit over a number of decades of never giving anything a moment's thought, it occurred to him that you could confront a winged creature while knee deep in mud and unprotected by anything at all. When the dragon had appeared for the second time, the celebration of victory had yielded to the most intense and total terror. Slump, who had already faced the dragon and who had been routed with a pannier of grapes, and who thus had a certain amount of experience in this area, was appointed camp commandant with the responsibility for the defense of the adjacent district, which meant everything outside the walls of Delagar. Uh, the result had been a series of hysterical panics, alternating alternating with the umpteenth retelling of his rout of the dragon. First they had dug trenches around the moors. Then they had abandoned them to dig them under the vines. Then they had started to erect a rampart that was never completed but abandoned shortly after the beginning to return to the initial idea, trenches around the moors. Robbie stopped for a moment. She couldn't go on. Her arms hurt and she had blisters on her hands. She was hungry too. There was nothing to steal when digging trenches. She was tired. She really couldn't go on. It was said that the dragon had been injured. Perhaps it wouldn't come back. Perhaps everything was lost. Perhaps the dragon they had seen and seen again had been nothing but a crazy dream. Perhaps no one was coming. No one would save her. Not her and not any of the others. Everything would stay as it was. Suddenly, an image of paradise came speeding through the mud. Hope was rekindled and spirits lifted. The fattest rat that Robbie had ever encountered. And not just her, Kala had seen it too. The two little girls swapped glances. Meat, and lots of it. A whole rat. A big, fat sewer rat. When Robbie had been sent to the house of orphans, they had taken away her clothes, her shoes, and the big rough woolen shawl her mother had wrapped around her. But Robbie had managed to save her slingshot. Her father had made it for her. It was a strip of leather with a wider part that held a stone. Robbie had managed to hide it, inspection after inspection, in the pocket sewn with threads of straw inside her filthy jacket. Flash and Slump were at the other end of the long trench, and neither Robbie nor Kala had yet been granted permission to answer the call of nature that was granted to all infant workers. Once a day, the two little girls went dashing after the rat, which took refuge behind the white thorn and blackberry bushes that bordered the clearing before the forest. Robbie was able to take out the slingshot, pick up a stone, and fire without anyone seeing her. Bam! A clear and precise shot. The rat collapsed. The two children hurried back to their place in the trench. The day passed slowly until lunchtime, when every digging child would stand in line to receive the 6 chestnuts and half an apple provided by the generosity of the county of Delaga. The rat was a communal meal. Grapes, blackberries, nuts, eggs, and apples were things that you could wolf down all by yourself, without having to say a word to anyone. But a rat, if it was to be edible, had to be skinned and roasted, two tasks that could only be accomplished by the whole community of beloved guests at the House of Orphans. Moving as though at random along the trenches, Robbie managed to end up standing beside Falco and Foulpest and tell them of her catch. Her heart broke as she did it. It meant that those two would have half of the rat all to themselves. The other half would be shared among everyone, because the skinning and cooking would be done in the dormitory, using the little brazier that heated it up, and that would mean a tiny piece for everyone. But a tiny piece is still better than nothing. Not to mention the fact that it would be a kind of party. When the time came for the food to be distributed, Foulpest went to do it by himself, while Falco with Robbie and Calla slipped off to the blackberry bushes to recover the prey. They carried the sack that had held the chestnuts, and which was empty by now, in such a way as to make the rat disappear inside it, and to smuggle it into the dormitory in the evening. A rat was not a theft, and there were no punishments set aside for it, but equally it would be confiscated as a distraction from work, and would attract all kinds of accusations of ingratitude and barbarism. How could you? Flash would squawk. With all the good things you get to eat at the House of Orphans, all in great abundance and so beautifully cooked. They're barbarians, Slump would snort as he roused himself from his usual cataleptic state. The children of barbarians with barbarian practices. It's a good thing that we're here now, and that being intelligent, we can teach them. The rat was no longer in the clearing. Or rather, to be more precise, it was still there, but it wasn't where they had left it. Instead of being on the ground, stone, dead, it had been picked up by a character who looked like a cloud, with hairy legs, because he was wearing an incredibly filthy wedding dress, pulled up and knotted at the waist. This character was very young, a boy, a little older than the children themselves. Robbie wondered whether, if the dress had been less dirty, the ensemble might have been any less ridiculous. The problem wasn't so much the dirt. It was the unbearable and unmistakable stench of bird excrement emanating from it. Even the children who slept in an old half-dilapidated sheepfold without any opportunities to wash except when they had to work on the rain found it unbearable. The stranger was holding the rat on his knees, and as he stroked it, he spoke as if it were a relative or a dear friend. The rat looked at him beatifically as its tail swung gently back and forth. Clearly, Robbie had only stunned her prey, and equally clearly the smell of bird excrement was doing the rat a great deal of good. The stranger and the rat sat looking at one another for a long and tender moment. And then the rat slipped to the ground and crept lazily away. Past the white thorn bush, not even in the 2 years she had spent in the company of Slump, and had Robbie witnessed a scene too full of idiocy. Of a guy dressed up as a filthy bride, stinking of bird excrement, cuddling a rat as though it were his own child. Calla took a step backward, and Robbie reassured her by giving her arm a quick squeeze. The stranger noticed the gesture and smiled. The first to recover was Falco. Stupid, snotty cretin, girl child. You don't even know when you've killed a rat and when you haven't, he sneered. But it was that, Robbie protested, her humiliation matched only by her astonishment. It is now, the stranger said. Calla started crying. For hours she had been thinking of the roasted rat, dreaming of sinking her teeth into her little piece of meat, and everyone would have said that she and Robbie were really clever, two real huntresses. and everyone would have been happy, and the roasted meat of the rat would have gone scrunch under her teeth. Robbie did kill it, Kala insisted. We would have eaten it, she added disconsolately. Don't eat anything that has ever thought, the stranger reproached her gently. This assertion was so wildly eccentric that Kala immediately began to wail. The stranger got on his feet, still smiling. He was the handsomest boy Robbie had ever seen. If only he had been less stupid and didn't give off such a pestilential stench. Do rats think? Falco asked in a puzzled voice. Robbie replied with a vague shrug. If Slump could think. What does that mean? Falco asked again. Robbie gave an even vaguer shrug. Do you think he's an elf? Falco asked, lowering his voice. The veil had fallen from the stranger's head, revealing very pale hair and pointed ears. No, Robbie replied firmly. How can you be so sure? Elves are swine, but they are also supposed to be intelligent, Robbie whispered back. The stranger looked at them and smiled even more broadly. Then he bowed and said, Josh Kronk Squackle Yolnastrink. Bless you, Robbie replied politely, as her mother had told her to do when someone sneezed. Bless you too, said the stranger. You can call me Yorsh if you like. I'm looking for someone from the village of Astrid. Kala and Falco both pointed at Robbie, with their arms straight and their index fingers outstretched. The stranger's eyes remained fixed on Kala's little hand, which was missing a thumb. He looked at it for a long time before coming out with the idiotic statement, Your thumb's missing. Kala lowered her arm and then her eyes mortified. The tremble returned to her lower lip, and she was shaken by a few silent sobs. Robbie looked at the stranger with hatred in her eyes. She dreamed of being big enough and strong enough to give him a good thump. The stranger approached Kala and took her left hand between his two hands and held it for a long time, gazing into nothingness. Kala was frightened, yet she didn't move or try to pull back. She just stood there, her eyes lost in the blue of the stranger's eyes, which were in turn lost in the void. The stranger started to turn pale, then white, and a vague tremor began to shake him. Robbie wondered if it mightn't be a contagious disease and approached to pull Kala away. There was no need. The stranger's hands opened and Kala's filthy, mutilated hand was free again. The stranger fell on his knees in the mud, unable to stay upright, and then came out with a second idiotic sentence. Your hand will be all right. Do you know that? Adults don't heal, but children do. Kala stared at him in fascination, and Robbie's fury mounted. The stranger turned toward Robbie once again. I knew there was a child from Astrid here, he said. Someone left a trail of stones, and that's something only a child can do. A child? Falco glanced at Robbie, the unmistakable look that people give to idiots, and Robbie felt that she hated the stranger with all his soul. My compliments, my dear lady. Pray tell me what happened to your laughing village, and for what reason you are here now, and what are you doing? What you are doing? At the words, my dear lady, Robbie had hastily turned around, imagining that Flash must be behind her. When she was sure that the stranger was speaking only to her, her rage and frustration with this unbearable clown, he said his name was Yorsh, who had not only robbed her of her dinner, but made her laughing stock far exceeded her already limited patience. She bent forward to pick up a stick and waved it at the stranger. I'm smaller than you, but I can hit harder, she told him threateningly. And don't you dare touch her again, she added, nodding toward Kala, without taking her eyes off him. The stranger looked extremely ill. He trembled and gasped for breath. Forgive me, my dear lady, if I have offended against your customs. It was far from deliberate. Excellent. No, imbecile. No, not that either. Robbie's expression became more menacing. Her hands gripped the branch more tightly. The stranger suddenly remembered something and opened an embroidered blue velvet bag on the strap around his neck. He took out a little wooden boat and a little rag doll, its hair made of sheepskin, dyed with walnut juice to make it rich and black, like Robbie's. These are yours, aren't they? Said the stranger, holding them out. I found them in Astrid. I've brought them back to you. Robbie wished the stranger would disappear, sink into the lock, vanish into the mud, or that the dragon would come and take him away. At the same time, she looked at her little boat and her doll with a fierce desire to touch them once again. Her mind filled with the memory of her father carving the hull of the ship from a block of beech, and her mother cutting from her very own cape the material for the doll's little dress. It was all that was left of her parents. She stretched out her hand and silently took them. What happened in Astrid? The stranger asked gently. Robbie went on looking at him sulkily, then slowly brought the stick down. It was destroyed, she murmured. Why? Robbie said nothing. She didn't want to remember. She didn't feel like talking. Why? Repeated the stranger. Selfishness, Robbie said in a tired voice, detaching the syllables from one another. What does that mean? Robbie said nothing. They didn't pay enough taxes, explained Falco, breaking into the conversation. They didn't want to pay, he added, sounding pompous, and leaning on the word want in an imitation of flesh. They couldn't, Robbie protested desperately. They couldn't. The stranger nodded thoughtfully. Are the inhabitants of the village alive? Robbie nodded. And where are they? The stranger went on. They escaped to the other side of the dark mountains, beyond the waterfall. Now they are living on the seashore. It wasn't a secret. The soldiers knew. They had never gone in search of the defectors simply because they were too frightened of the waterfall. Do you know a man called Monzer and a woman called Saria? The stranger asked. Silence. Do you know a man called Monzer and a woman called Saria? The stranger repeated. Robbie's eyes filled with tears. She gripped the little boat and the doll. They were my father and mother, she said softly. Where? Insisted the stranger. They were hanged, said Falco. The stranger turned pale. Why? He asked in a strange, strangled tone when he managed to get his voice back. Why? Selfishness, Robbie said between sobs, and Robbie couldn't go on. And, the stranger said encouragingly, and they say they have protected an elf, but I know it isn't true. It can't be. Robbie couldn't finish. No! Screamed Josh. No, 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 no. They gave life. They are dead. They left you as an orphan for saving me. The stranger covered his face with his hands. He knelt on the earth, huddled in on himself, shaking like a leaf on a branch in the winter wind. Falco smiled triumphantly. He is an elf! Robbie stopped crying. She raised her head and then looked down at the weeping creature at her feet. Was he really an elf? The elf? The one for whom had her parents really died and left her an orphan for this thing here? Because of him, she didn't have a father or a mother? No dried apples and partridges on a spit, or a warm bed and milk with honey in the morning for this wretched creature who couldn't do anything but mock a group of hungry children and make fun of somebody's mutilated hand? It wasn't true. It couldn't be. And now Robbie recognized the dress he was wearing. It was the wedding dress of the village head's daughter. Her mother had even helped to embroider the T on the front. Rage overcame her grief, and a very modest kick from her bare feet made contact with Yosh, who was already too upset to notice. "Go away!" yelled Robbie. "None of what you have said is true. Go away!" She spat out on him, but George remained motionless. He had fainted. Robbie hadn't time to think of anything else to say or do. Flash's shouts behind her let her know that break time was over. "He is an elf!" cried Falco, pointing to the prostrate figure at their feet. The words rang out until they reached the soldiers. A few arrows flew. Robbie, Kala, and Falco threw themselves to the ground and covered their hands with their hands. Their heads with their hands. Yosh remained motionless. He was barely breathing. The hill that could be glimpsed behind the house of orphans suddenly moved. It was a dragon, crouching in the grass. He was very close, and he was enormous. Everybody ran in all directions apart from the three on the ground, who couldn't see properly because of all the things in the way, and who remained stretched out on the ground with their hands over their heads, unable to work out what was going on. They understood when a hot and stinking wind blew over them. Looking up, they found themselves staring into the dragon's jaws, and it was suddenly clear that the wind was the breath coming from a mouth with fangs as long as an arm. Fortunately, the dragon hadn't even noticed them. He was trying to find a way of taking Yorsh between his jaws with a secure grip, but without hurting the elf boy. "Robbie!" Kala called out. "Shh! Shush now!" "Robbie, I've wet myself." "It doesn't matter. In fact, it's quite a good idea," whispered Robbie reassuringly. "It'll make you less good to eat. Now be quiet." But the dragon wasn't even slightly interested in them. He was still busy working out how to transport Yosh. After a few attempts with his fangs, he opted to use his claws. He would hold the boy's ankles with the claws of his left foot, and his wrists with those of his right foot. Then the dragon spread his enormous emerald green wings and rose slowly upward. When he was high in the sky, very high, a few arrows flew up improbably after him. Robbie stayed on the ground, not knowing what to do, until Flash's hands took her by the shoulder and pulled her onto her feet. "You," Flash began, her voice choking with rage. You miserable elf lover. Yeah, that's it. Elf lover. Like your father and your mother. Glory. He to Deliga for putting them to death. Miserable scoundrels. But I've had my eye on you, you know. I knew. You're the one who drew them to us. It's your fault, isn't it?" Robbie didn't even try to reply. She knew it would only increase Flash's rage and the fury of her blows. She tried to protect herself as best she could. She felt so terrible that Flash's slaps were really the least of her problems. Her mother and father had condemned themselves to death and her to her unhappiness, all for a miserable cretin. The dream that had pursued her since her life and her family had been destroyed. A dragon with a prince dressed in white had come true, and an elfish villain wearing a wedding dress covered with bird poo and various kinds of duck dung had descended on her to make her wretched life even more complicated than it was already. By the time Flash had calmed down, Robbie was covered with bruises. Slump had arrived as well, and was deciding that what needed to be done. He himself would go to Deliga and request the reinforcements necessary to bring the little witch to the city. "Yes, witch," he added, turning to Robbie. "A real witch. That's what we call elf lovers." The journey would take half a day. He couldn't risk his precious life by escorting her himself. The dragon and the elf would attack again. They had clearly attacked the place to free her. Fine, Robbie thought bitterly. She was about to leave for Deliga for a prison cell, which would probably be followed by a gallows, just as she had reached the minimum age, which made her eligible for hanging. Although she wasn't yet considered an adult in other respects. The second part of her dream was about to come true as well. thanks to the dragon and the prince, she would be leaving the House of Orphans forever. She allowed herself to be carried to one of the sentry boxes, where she was put in chains. The two archers would keep watch over her as they waited for the other troops to arrive. Robbie hunched up with her head between her elbows, the boat and the doll clutched in her hands, letting time slip over her, while her thoughts went on milling around inside her head, like a flock of crazed crows. Time passed. Every now and again, Robbie's eyes closed with exhaustion, but no images formed except sometimes a little left hand with its 5 fingers spread. Slump came back. He had an entire garrison with him. They had come to get her. They removed her chains and made her put on a lighter kind suitable for travel. Then they set her on a donkey. Robbie had never ridden before, but she was too desperate to bother about the fact. It was a sad and foggy day, softening the colors of autumn. The other orphans were crowded around in silence in the clearing in front of the old sheepfold. A hand was raised in a gesture of farewell, and remained open in the air with all 5 fingers spread. Flash barked something, but the little hand remained stubbornly in the air, and finally Robbie realized that it wasn't a wave. Carla was holding up her little left hand with the 5 perfect fingers attached to it, including the thumb. The one that the hatchet had cut off 2 years before. Robbie looked at Carla's hands, both of which were raised. Now she felt short of breath, and for a moment her vision grew hazy. Finally she figured it out. A creature kind and powerful beyond imagination had crossed the path, and all she had done was kick and spit at it. She went on staring at Carla until the little girl was out of sight. The donkey walked on, escorted by a garrison of soldiers that would have been large enough to fight an army of trolls. That was chapter 27. And next time I read chapter 28. But till then, see ya.